Somewhere on Earth right now, a bowl of rice is sitting in front of someone. And they are not thinking about it at all. That's the whole point of rice. It's supposed to be invisible, reliable, boring. More than half the people alive today eat it as their main source of calories, and the vast majority of the country growing the most of it is China. But here's something most people never picture when they think about farmland. Not all land is created equal, and a huge amount of it can't grow rice at all. If you took every acre of salty, unusable soil on the planet and laid it out as one continuous stretch, it would cover more ground than the entire United States, coastline to coastline, twice over. Salt does to a rice plant roughly what salt water does to a car engine. It doesn't just make things harder, it actively breaks the machinery down from the inside, cell by cell, until the plant simply can't pull water out of the ground anymore. For most of human history, that land has just sat there, unused, while the population that needs to eat kept growing. China looked at that problem and decided the soil itself was the thing worth fixing. But here's the part most people never hear about. China already feeds around 1/5 of the world's population, using less than 1/10 of the world's farmable land. There isn't much room left to expand the old-fashioned way, by simply plowing more fields. Meanwhile, the country sits on roughly 100 million hectares of saline-alkali soil, salty, alkaline land that ordinary rice simply cannot survive in. That's an area larger than every farm in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined, sitting almost entirely unused, right at a time when feeding people is only getting harder. That is the gap Chinese agricultural scientists set out to close. Starting with a research program launched in 2012 by Yuan Longping, the scientist known across China as the father of hybrid rice. By 2016, that work had grown into the Qingdao Saline-Alkali Tolerant Rice Research and Development Center, based in Shandong province on the coast of the Yellow Sea. If you find it fascinating, when scientists take a problem everyone else assumed was permanent and just quietly start solving it, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Why did nobody fix this sooner? The honest answer is that breeding salt tolerance into rice isn't some obscure idea nobody thought of. Scientists have understood the basic biology of plant salt stress for decades. The real obstacle was never the idea, it was the plant itself. Ordinary rice varieties have spent thousands of years being bred for one thing: yield and fresh water on stable soil and predictable conditions. Push that same plant into salty ground, and its roots essentially lose the ability to draw in water at all, even when the field is soaking wet, because the salt outside the root is now pulling water in the wrong direction. The plant slowly dehydrates while sitting in liquid. Breeding a rice variety that can tolerate that stress means crossbreeding with rare, naturally salt-tolerant strains, ones that usually produce a fraction of the yield a farmer needs to make a living. For decades, every attempt hit the same wall. You could get a rice plant to survive in salty soil, but the harvest was so small it wasn't worth planting. Survival wasn't the hard part. Making it profitable was. That trade-off is exactly why saline alkali land across the world sat untouched for so long, not because nobody cared, but because it grows, and it's worth growing, turned out to be two completely different engineering problems. China's program didn't try to invent a shortcut around that trade-off. It attacked it directly, using the same hybrid breeding techniques that had already tripled the country's ordinary rice output since the 1970s, and pointed them at salt tolerance instead of raw yield. Here's the mechanism that changed everything. At the Qingdao Center, researchers don't start by picking one perfect rice plant. They start with hundreds of them. In early trials, the team screened as many as 200 different rice strains at once, planting them directly into test plots irrigated with water pumped in from the Yellow Sea itself, then diluted down to a controlled salinity level. That salinity is measured precisely, typically starting around 0.3% salt content and increasing towards 0.6%, roughly a tenth of full-strength seawater, which is already enough to kill most conventional rice varieties within weeks. Out of each batch, only a small number of strains survive long enough to be evaluated for yield, and only a fraction of those actually produce a usable harvest. The ones that do get crossbred, using conventional hybridization and backcrossing, the same core hybrid rice technique Yuan Longping pioneered decades earlier, essentially breeding the salt-tolerant traits into higher yield genetic backgrounds over multiple generations. It's slow, iterative work, seasons of trial and error compressed into breeding cycles, not a single laboratory breakthrough. The results have been measurable and specific. One two-line hybrid variety, known as Qiao 1000, reached a yield of just over 12 tons per hectare while growing in fields with salinity between 0.2 and 0.6%, according to a 2024 review published in the journal Plant Breeding. For comparison, that's in the same range as strong yields for conventional rice grown in ordinary non-saline soil, which is the entire point. The goal was never just survival in salty ground. It was making salty ground competitive with normal farmland. In test fields in Jiangsu province, the program has recorded yields as high as roughly 691.8 kilograms per MU, which converts to just over 10 tons per hectare, under conditions with roughly 0.4% salt content sustained across the entire growing season. To get a sense of how difficult that number actually is, remember that a plant growing in that soil is essentially fighting a slow, constant chemical battle against its own roots, every single day, for the entire length of the season, and still producing a commercially viable harvest at the end of it. There's also a genetic side to this story that goes beyond simple crossbreeding. Researchers studying salt tolerance in rice have identified specific genetic pathways that let certain strains regulate sodium uptake at the cellular level, essentially giving the plant a way to keep excess salt out of its most sensitive tissues while still drawing in the water it needs. That kind of molecular detail matters because it means breeders aren't just gambling on which plants happen to survive. They're increasingly able to select for the specific traits responsible for that survival, generation after generation, which speeds up a process that used to depend almost entirely on trial and error in the field. The steel and soil challenger nobody saw coming. Growing better rice was only half of the puzzle. The other half was the land itself, because even a perfect seed will fail in soil that's too chemically hostile to support root growth at all. That's where a parallel, less publicized effort has been running alongside the rice breeding program. Large-scale soil remediation, physically changing the chemistry of saline-alkali land before a single seed goes into the ground. In Dan, in Jilin Province, in China's northeast, local agricultural companies have been running exactly this kind of dual-track project, combining irrigation and drainage engineering with salt-tolerant crop varieties to convert thousands of hectares of previously unusable land into working farmland. Local officials there have described plans to convert roughly 2,000 hectares of saline-alkali land into high-standard farmland in a single year, using repeated flushing and drainage cycles to physically pull salt out of the soil profile before planting even begins. In Hebei Province, in a coastal county called Liaoting, a different model has taken shape entirely. Rice paddies that double as habitat for shrimp and crab, an approach local farmers say has cut the salt content of the surrounding soil roughly in half over the course of 2 growing seasons, while generating income from 3 different sources on the same plot of land at once. One farmer in that program, working roughly 100 hectares of saline-alkali tolerant rice, about 6.7 hectares, reported earning tens of thousands of yuan in annual net income from a field that would have produced essentially nothing a decade earlier. This is the part of the story that rarely makes the headlines because it isn't a single dramatic breakthrough. It's hundreds of smaller, less glamorous wins, soil chemistry, drainage engineering, aquaculture, and plant breeding, all being layered on top of each other at the same time in different provinces by different teams, converging on the same goal. The world starts paying attention. China's saline-alkali rice program didn't stay a domestic curiosity for long. In 2018, a Chinese team working with the private investment office of the ruler of Dubai successfully planted saltwater-tolerant rice directly in the desert of the United Arab Emirates, using diluted seawater for irrigation, and recorded a yield of more than 7.5 tons per hectare, in conditions Chinese researchers described as the world's first successful case of growing rice in a tropical desert environment. That trial mattered less for its size and more for what it proved, that soil and water conditions once considered permanently unfarmable could, in the right hands, produce a real harvest, not just a laboratory curiosity. Since then, the underlying research has drawn in international academic collaboration as well, with recent published studies on rice salt tolerance co-authored between Chinese institutions like Guangdong Ocean University and universities in Pakistan, reflecting a wider global research community now working on the same underlying biology. Soil salinization isn't a uniquely Chinese problem either. Saline and alkaline soil affects more than 30 countries worldwide, covering over 900 million hectares globally, according to figures cited by China's state news agency, Xinhua, which means whatever breeding and remediation techniques prove reliable in Shandong or Jilin have a genuine global market waiting for them, from South and Southeast Asia to parts of Africa and the Middle East. One researcher involved in the program's international outreach put it simply, solve this problem once properly, and you're not just feeding one country, you're handing every coastal and arid nation on Earth a blueprint they didn't have before. The real-world proof point is already growing, literally, in the ground right now. By 2021, the Qingdao Center's demonstration program had expanded to test bases across 10 different sites nationwide, spanning wildly different conditions, from the cold permafrost regions of Heilongjiang in the northeast to the deserts surrounding Kashgar in Xinjiang in the far northwest. The team recorded an average yield across all of these different planting areas of more than 6 tons per hectare. A number of researchers at the center described at the time as the threshold where growing saline-alkali tolerant rice actually becomes economically worthwhile for an ordinary farmer, not just a research demonstration. In 2022, the program's peak test yield reached that previously mentioned 691.8 kilograms per mu figure, a new record for the project at that point, up from 590.6 kilograms per mu the year before, and up further still from 295.9 kilograms per mu just 3 years earlier. That trajectory, roughly doubling in 3 years, is the kind of curve that turns a research pilot into something a government is willing to keep funding. By 2023, the total area under some form of saline-alkali crop cultivation across China, spanning rice alongside wheat, soybeans, sorghum, and other salt-tolerant crops developed through related programs, had expanded well beyond the original 10 demonstration bases, with regional hubs like Dongying in Shandong's Yellow River Delta, hosting more than 30 dedicated science and technology innovation platforms, and drawing in over 100 research teams from more than 50 universities and institutes. That's not the footprint of a single lab experiment anymore. That's an entire regional research economy that's grown up around one specific soil chemistry problem. These aren't projected numbers on a slide deck. These are fields that were harvested, weighed, and recorded season after season in soil that used to be considered a write-off. So how big could this actually get? The original ambition, laid out publicly by Yuan Longping's team back in 2020, was enormous. Transform roughly 6.7 million hectares of China's saline-alkali land into working rice paddies over 8 to 10 years, producing enough additional rice to feed an estimated 80 million more people every year. To put that scale in perspective, that's a land conversion effort roughly equivalent in size to the entire country of Ireland, turned from unusable salt flats into productive farmland, feeding a population larger than Germany's entirely from land that used to produce nothing at all. If even a meaningful fraction of China's roughly 100 million hectares of saline-alkali land could eventually support this kind of rice cultivation, the long-term implications for national food security and for food security in similarly affected countries abroad would be difficult to overstate. Now, the honest limitations, because the actual numbers tell a more complicated story than the original headline promise. In March 2022, the effort was formalized into the National Center of Technology Innovation for Saline-Alkali Tolerant Rice, headquartered in Sanya on Hainan Island, consolidating research from institutions across the country under one coordinated program. But the center's own published target for 2030 is far more modest than the original 6.7 million hectare vision, developing 10 to 15 new rice varieties suited to different saline-alkali regions planted across roughly 66,700 hectares nationwide, less than 1% of the land originally targeted back in 2020. That gap between the early, ambitious framing and the center's own stated near-term goals is worth sitting with honestly. It doesn't mean the science failed. It means turning a successful research result into millions of hectares of working farmland runs into the same wall almost every large-scale agricultural transformation runs into. Soil remediation is slow, capital-intensive, and highly site-specific, since saline-alkali land in the frozen ground of Heilongjiang behaves completely differently from saline-alkali land in the deserts near Kashgar. Farmers also need consistent access to irrigation water, even diluted, salty water, in regions that are sometimes water scarce to begin with, which limits exactly where these varieties can realistically be deployed at scale. And while yields have improved dramatically since the program's earliest trials, saline-alkali tolerant rice still generally produces somewhat less per hectare than the very best conventional rice varieties grown in ideal, non-saline conditions, meaning it functions best as a way to bring unused land into production, not necessarily as a wholesale replacement for existing high-yield farmland. There's a labor and infrastructure cost, too, one that rarely makes it into the more triumphant coverage of this program. Converting raw saline-alkali land into something plantable typically requires repeated irrigation and drainage cycles just to physically flush salt out of the topsoil before a single seed goes in, work that has to happen before yield numbers even become relevant, and that isn't cheap or fast in regions without existing water infrastructure. China's own government has acknowledged this gap in blunter terms elsewhere, noting that of the roughly 100 million hectares of saline-alkali land in the country, only somewhere around a third is realistically considered usable with current technology and current levels of investment, meaning the remaining two-thirds sits outside what any breeding program, however successful, can currently reach. The honest picture, a decade in, is a program that has proven the science works, has scaled from a handful of research plots to genuine commercial farming across more than 10 provinces, and is still, by its own government's current targets, only a fraction of the way toward the scale its founder once described. Which brings it back to that bowl of rice. The one nobody thinks about, sitting quietly on a table, made from a plant that has spent the last decade quietly being redesigned to survive in soil that used to be considered permanently dead. It's easy to romanticize the giant, single dramatic breakthrough. The real story here is slower and less cinematic. A research center in a coastal Chinese city patiently testing hundreds of rice strains in salty water season after season for over a decade, chasing a percentage point of yield improvement at a time. That's usually what actually solving a problem this size looks like. If you find stories like this, unglamorous science quietly expanding what's actually possible to grow, and where worth following, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And here's a question worth sitting with. If a piece of land can go from completely unusable to producing 10 tons of rice per hectare simply by changing what's planted in it, not the land itself, what other resources do you think we're currently writing off as worthless, simply because we haven't bred the right thing to grow there yet?